Illinois is home to some of the most notorious serial killers to date, including John Wayne Gacy and Richard Speck. But today we're going to examine the crimes of some of the other serial killers that made Illinois their home. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. If you'd like to support the channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss video upload. Let's get started. On January 10th, 1997, firefighters were called because a house had been on fire. The fire was on the north side of Chicago, and unfortunately, inside the home, officials would find the body of a woman. The victim was homeowner Dorota Disbuck, who was a single mother with a 5-year-old daughter. Luckily, the girl was not home at the time of the fire. Of course, police realized that this could potentially be a crime scene, but there was no signs of a struggle or forced entry. But when they got the medical examiner's report back, they realized that she had been strangled. They did suspect that she had been sexually assaulted, but it couldn't be confirmed during the autopsy. Police would dive into the investigation right away. They would begin speaking to those closest to Dorota. They would speak to one friend who reported that Dorota had recently spoken with a prospective buyer for her home, and that person gave her a very unsettling vibe. They would look through Dorota's phone records, specifically those on the day of the fire. It appears that Dorota had been called from a payphone near her home. Unfortunately, there was no security cameras in the area where that payphone was. Unfortunately, only 3 weeks later, on February 3rd, the fire department would respond to another fire. This time, it was at an apartment complex. Inside the burning apartment, firefighters would discover the bodies of a young woman and a girl. The victims were identified as Yolanda Gutzer, who was 35, and her daughter Jessica Munez, who was 10. Their hands had been tied behind their backs, and their throats had been slit. Investigators would soon realize that the room they had been in had been doused with an accelerant and then torched. The medical examiner would determine that both mother and daughter had bled to death and that they were both sexually assaulted. But this time, investigators were able to recover DNA evidence. But there were no matches in the database. Police would learn that Yolanda had posted flyers on a local bulletin board to sell books. And on that flyer, she included her phone number. So of course, investigators would instantly pull her phone logs, and they were startled to see that there was calls that came from a nearby payphone. Again, they would go to that payphone, but there was no evidence. Although there were similarities in both cases, they still lacked evidence to establish a solid connection. But it did sit in the back of their mind that they were very similar, almost eerily so. And then 6 weeks later, firefighters get another call. This time there was a fire at a condo. Unfortunately, they would find the body of Kazmira Peruch. She was 44, and they found her naked from the waist down. They would soon learn that she had been stabbed, beaten, and soaked with an accelerant. Investigators would quickly realize that there was a for sale sign on the front of her home. Investigators would lack DNA evidence, but they were almost certain now that they had a serial killer on their hand. Like the other victims, Kazmira had also been sexually assaulted. By this time, Chicago police had reached out to the FBI because they needed a profile of the killer. And of course, the profile stated that the murderer appeared to derive excitement from the risk and thrill of the kill, and that setting fire to the victims made this person feel powerful. And then 3 years later, a match would come in that database. That match was to 30-year-old Paul Rung. Little is known about Paul's early life. Though he was born in Oak Forest, and since childhood, he had exhibited sexual sadism, and it appears that it worsened when his mother died. He was about 17 when she passed. Later that year, he would kidnap, rape, and beat up a 14-year-old girl in Oak Forest. He would turn himself into authorities and was given a 14-year sentence for the crime, but he was paroled in May of 1994. During the time, he married a woman, got a job as a salesman, and then later a truck driver. He would resettle in 3 different cities prior to his eventual arrest in May of 1997, and he was arrested for violating the conditions of his parole. By the year 2000, he had already been on police's radar for about 5 years at that time. They strongly suspected that he was involved in a 1995 murder of Stacy Frobel, who was 25, and she had known Paul. Stacy was found because a dog had returned home with a dismembered leg that belonged to Stacy. Unfortunately, her body parts had been scattered around the Illinois-Wisconsin border. Police would question Paul, and when he was questioned, he denied knowing anything about it. But they had no evidence to directly tie him to the murder. They were able to get a search warrant for his apartment, and there they found weapons which violated his parole conditions. So he was sent back to prison to serve out the remaining 7 years of his prior 14-year sentence. During his time in jail, police would question him about the murder of Jessica Muniz, and they would tell him that they had his DNA. He would look at investigators and say, "You got me." By now, police had already theorized that he was finding his victims through classified ads. Whether it was selling a house or posting a bulletin board, he would look for women, contact them, say he was interested in whatever they were selling, and then sexually assault them, murder them, and set their homes on fire. And Paul would confess to this. And then he would shock everybody and confess to 2 more murders. He would also confess to killing 2 sisters, Amelia and Dezenta. The serial killer would say that he murdered and dismembered the 2 young women. He would tell investigators that he beat, bound, raped, and then dismembered the women after luring them from their apartment with the promise of house cleaning jobs. He would say that he put their body parts into pillowcases and garbage bags that he would later toss into trash bins along North Avenue. The 2 sisters had come to America in January of 1995 to escape ethnic cleansing. Their father was an engineer who cashed in his nest egg to send them here. The 2 girls were smuggled out of their country and brought to America in hopes for a better life, but they would soon encounter a vicious serial killer. The girls did live with their uncle for a short amount of time, but they would soon find work and get their own apartment. Unfortunately, they had been laid off of work and were unemployed when they heard about these housekeeping jobs. It appears that a former coworker had warned the girls to be careful when meeting with Paul. When one of the sisters tried to run out of his house, he would tell police that he grabbed her by the back of her head and would slam her head on a concrete slab near the front door. He would carry her outside, dropping her on the basement steps where she struck her head again, and then he placed her in a filled bathtub and left the room. He said that she had drowned by the time he returned. Amelia was handcuffed to a weight bench, raped, and then strangled. He was charged with 7 counts of murder, and in January of 2006 would stand trial. He was convicted and later sentenced to death. Eventually, the death penalty was outlawed in Illinois, so he was later sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. This man was just an absolute nightmare, and it's a good reminder to be careful anytime you have to meet a stranger. Our next serial killer is known as the Bone Crusher, and he's accused of murdering 8 women in Illinois. Larry Bright was described as a popular kid who loved to fish, play football, and spend time with his friends. But sometime in early 2003, something changed in this young man, and he would soon be accused of murdering 8 women. Although Larry Bright had a normal upbringing, he got involved in crime around the age of 19. He would serve 2 years in prison for vehicle and residential burglary. During his teenage years, he did smoke marijuana, but after prison, he began to use heavy drugs, such as cocaine. He would injure his back while working as a concrete worker, and then become addicted to painkillers. Around this time, he would start picking up sex workers, and then he would begin to murder them. Sabrina Payne, who is 36, was found on July 27, 2003, and she is considered to be Larry Bright's first known victim. Larry Bright would offer her money in exchange for sex. He would drive Sabrina Payne to his home, but he would later claim that he had no memory of how he killed her, and he was intoxicated at the time. But the autopsy would later reveal that Sabrina had been strangled. After the murder, he would take her body and try to conceal it in a cornfield. In August of 2004, he would meet 33-year-old sex worker Laura Lallar. Again, he would offer her money in exchange for sex. But during the sexual intercourse, he would strangle her and then burn her body in the backyard. She was only identified because he saw a picture of her during his interrogation. In late September of the same year, he would meet 40-year-old sex worker Linda K. Neal, and they met in the parking lot of a furniture store. This time, he would offer her drugs in exchange for sex. He would take her to his home like the other victims, where they would do crack cocaine and then have sex. But once Linda fell asleep, Larry would strangle her. Because his mother was home at the time, he decided to dispose of her body away from the home. He would discard it along a roadside, but this time he would leave traces from a shoelace on her neck, and the coroner would find biological evidence from a male perpetrator. Larry Bright's last confirmed murder took place on October 14th, 2004. This time he would kill 41-year-old Brenda Irving. During his interrogation, he would again claim that he had no memory of this woman's name or where they had met. But he did take her to his house, they did drugs, and then would have sex before he attacked her. But what surprised him was Brenda was incredibly strong and she resisted him fiercely. She even almost knocked him unconscious. She had almost run away, but was unable to open the door to leave the building. Larry took this time to strike her in the back of the head several times, and then he would strangle her to death. He did want to throw her in a nearby lake, but because he was still intoxicated, he would get lost and discard her body near a dairy farm. In October of 2004, the police department did create a task force to investigate these cases. And Larry Bright would come under suspicion when sex worker Vicky Bomar was arrested and offered to help investigators in exchange for a plea bargain. Vicky would claim that a client named Larry Bright lured her into an outbuilding of his mother's home, that they had used drugs and drank alcohol, and then he would attack her, attempt to rape her at knife point, but she managed to escape. And as investigators are studying this case and learning more about Larry Bright, they learned that there was at least 6 similar cases where Larry Bright had acted incredibly aggressive towards Black sex workers. Bright was taken in for questioning in December of 2004, but he refused to cooperate with police officers and denied that he had anything to do with it. So he was released due to lack of evidence. And then the district attorney got a search warrant on January 20th, 2005. They would head to Larry Bright's property to search for evidence. Investigators would find ashes and small bone fragments. Of course, Larry Bright was taken back into custody. Not long after he was charged with murder, he would confess to the murder of 8 women. Larry Bright was spared the death penalty because he made a full confession to authorities, but he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would confess to additional murders in Wisconsin, Oklahoma, Washington, and Arizona, but he would later retract his statements. Apparently, Larry Bright would claim that during his time in jail, before all of this happened, he was sexually abused on multiple occasions by Black prisoners. He would say that he developed an urge to punish Black people for the harm that had been done to him. He would receive the nickname the Bone Crusher because after he burnt the victims' bodies, he would take a hammer and begin to crush their bone fragments. These women suffered immeasurably at the hands of Larry Bright. And although he claims that he was sexually abused in prison, his reason for targeting Black workers was because he was not attracted to men. But if that was the case and he wanted to punish Black men, he could have just killed them. It appears that he wanted the control and he wanted to hurt Black women. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel and want to show support, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. If there's a case you'd like me to cover, pop it in the comments below, and I'll be sure to get to it. In the meantime, check out some other videos on my channel while you wait for the next upload, and I'll see you then.